Hello. Why don't you take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Okay, let's have a look. I got a whole bunch of questions again, for which I'm very grateful, obviously. Let's see what we can do. So, the first question, and again, I'm paraphrasing these things, you'll have to forgive me, is do dry inks work better on cheaper paper? For example, Pelikan 4001 blue black does well on cheap paper, but is considered a drier ink. Short answer, I would say yes. Why? Because cheaper paper, more porous paper, non-coated paper, simple copier paper, for example, has the charming property that it is quite absorbent, and that can lead to also all kinds of issues. You can get more feathering, you can get more bleed through, you can get more, even just more ghosting, more show through on the other side of the page. But there is a pro, there is a benefit to all this, and that is that ink gets sucked into that paper really quickly and also typically dries very quickly. So if you have a drier ink, then using a paper like that may not be a bad idea, because the ink gets sucked into that paper much more easily than if you have, say, a Rhodia style paper, which is coated. And as a result, that ink does not get sucked into the paper as much as it gets on cheaper paper. Now, the advantage of nicer paper, what I mean by that is Rhodia, Clairefontaine, the Tomoe River, these kinds of papers, is that there is less feathering, there is less show through and bleed through, if any at all. So your ink will tend to look a little nicer. But then if you want to balance things with a wetter ink, for example, a drier ink, well, then maybe using a cheaper paper is not a bad idea, right? It's a balancing act, as things always are with whatever you do, but with fountain pen use for sure. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Will using a drier ink on cheaper paper cause tipping of a fountain pen to eventually wear out, or will that happen anyway? Back in the day, fountain pen tipping was made of iridium, a very hard metal. But with iridium becoming a bit scarcer, now manufacturers use all kinds of tipping materials. Now, sometimes you see on very cheap pens no tipping at all, and then I'm not talking about steel italic nibs, which often don't have tipping. Those are not necessarily cheap nibs, but on very cheap nibs, I have reviewed a few of those. I want to say the Reynolds Grippy is something that comes to mind. These are nibs that don't even have tipping, they're just steel that gets folded in on itself, and then that becomes the tipping material, which actually touches the paper. Now, provided you're not talking about super cheap pens like that, and even that, it's stainless steel folded over. It's not, in my mind, super soft, but I suppose it might wear out faster, obviously, than a harder metal, which you would expect on, I don't really want to say better nibs, but typically the somewhat more expensive nibs. And that doesn't mean gold nibs. That can also be a very nice Jowo steel nib, right? That can be all that's required here. Now, after that preamble, what happens to your tipping material? Is it going to wear out? Yes, it will, because everything in the world wears out. That's the charm of the world. Everything is ephemeral. Now, having said that, if you only use normal paper to write on, and that can be cheaper paper, I find it hard to believe that your tipping material would wear out that quickly. Are there nibs that are worn a bit? Absolutely. You can see that on some vintage pens. But these may be pens from the early 1900s. It is now the early 2000s. And yeah, if those pens have been used every day by people in the span of decades and decades, yeah, I suppose they might wear out at some point. None of the pens I own have worn out tipping, and I've written on all kinds of paper. The one type of paper that people sometimes get a little nervous about is that paper that is it silicon based? It's that paper that is what they typically call rock paper, which is made out of stone, right? That makes some people nervous sometimes. It's very smooth paper, very slick, and it's a little hard to tear. It's fun. I have reviewed some of this stuff because it's made of rocks. Yeah, okay. I have not really written on that type of paper for extended periods of time beyond what I did for the reviews. In all, I would really say I wouldn't worry too much. I mean, at some point, yeah, a pen may wear out, but I would find it hard to believe that with normal use, writing on normal paper, and I keep emphasizing that, so what I'm saying, and I know this is a gross exaggeration, if you're writing on sandpaper, well, then your nib is going to wear out. But who writes on sandpaper? Who does cuneiform with their fountain pens? If you write normal paper, I would find it hard to believe if you have a reasonable pen, so not a 50-cent cheap pen with a cheap nib. I find it hard to believe that nib would wear out in your lifetime. Whether you use Rhodia paper exclusively, this is not a commercial for Rhodia, by the way, but a lot of people find that a nicer paper. I am one of those people. Or whether that's copier paper. I don't think your tipping is going to wear out. Now, excuse me, is copier paper a little coarser? Yeah, it is a little coarser than a coated paper that's very smooth, because it's coarser. And sometimes I just amaze myself with my idiocy. But how much coarser are we talking about? I mean, it's not like you run your fingers along copier paper and you're skinned to the bone, right? So it's not something I would really worry about. Okay, I have another question. What is the best paper and ink combination for taking lasting notes? This kind of ties into an earlier discussion we have had about iron gall inks and permanent inks, for example. I think that there's a lot to say about this question, but I'll try to be brief. I do think that specific papers can be better options than other papers. You have specific, if you look in books, you will see that some are printed on acid-free paper. I can imagine that these kinds of qualities might affect how long the paper lasts, how long the ink on the paper lasts. I think the simplest way to answer that question, though, is think about what ink you are using. I am using here a pen BBS, 309 in rollerball mode with a washable blue ink. I use that to take some notes and put timestamps into my notes as I'm recording this video. That ink is going to wear out. And you should do the experiment if it's summer, wherever you are. Write a full page with washable blue ink of any brand. Leave it in the bright sun for a couple days. Not in the rain. Obviously it's a washable blue, but put it behind your window or something. See what happens. That kind of ink is washable. It's meant to come out of clothes if you stain it. Yeah, that's not going to be very permanent, is it? Because it's washable. So that kind of ink I would not use if you want to take lasting notes. There are permanent inks, which we've talked about in previous videos, so I'll keep it really short. There was a range of Mont Blanc permanent inks. There are the... I always mix up the brands. De Atramentis Document, I think, so the document inks. These inks are meant to last a very long time. Chemicals that bind to the page and that kind of stuff. That would be a good option. The greatest option in my mind is an iron gall ink, but you have to be very careful because iron gall inks there are reports online of them melting feeds of fountain pens. I've used iron gall inks for years. I've never had a molten feed, but that was probably because I cleaned my pens very well, I assume. So if you go down the route, I say route, but you can also say route if that makes more sense to you. If you tend to go down that route of iron gall inks, make sure you clean your pens very, very, very well. At the end of the day, you may have to accept, again, the charm of the world, that everything is ephemeral and nothing will last forever. Even if you use an iron gall ink and you use a notebook with good paper, then all I need is a big lighter and I'll make sure that your notes don't last forever. So things happen, right? But I would say a more permanent ink, a reasonable paper, is your best chance. A washable blue is your worst chance. Okay, final question. What do you think about, not necessarily people, but having multiple kinds of handwriting? For example, print with everything but fountain pens, but cursive with fountain pens and nothing else with fountain pens. I think I get where we're coming from here. I don't think I was asked for a deep psychological analysis or anything, but I think it makes sense. And there's, again, this is one of those things, so there's a lot to say. So I try to keep the more philosophical questions for the last questions in these videos, because I know that it doesn't appeal to everyone. One, fountain pens, a good fountain pen is fairly smooth. Yeah, there may be a bit of feedback, but in principle it's smooth. It's smoother typically than a ballpoint pen. You don't have to push down on it, right? So that makes for a smooth writing experience. So that's one. You have that. I also like to use cursive when I write with a fountain pen. I'm just thinking, I don't think I personally use anything but cursive. But back in the day, when I started with fountain pens, I had strange handwriting. I still have strange handwriting. Tell me about it. But now at least it's cursive. And at that point, it was a weird mix of some letters were cursive and some were print. It was a strange mix. But a fountain pen, being so smooth and so consistent in the way it flows, can be a very pleasant writer for cursive. Now, having said that, there are some specialty nibs, like say architect nibs, that were very popular at some point, and then that dies out again as trends come and go in the fountain pen world. I think the architect nib is a terrible nib for cursive writing. It's nice for, maybe, I think, because it's also known as a Hebrew grind or an Arabic grind. It's nicer, I think, for scripts that are written from right to left, but also have a very specific calligraphic quality to them, as Hebrew does, as Arabic does. But Western cursive is a whole different ball game. So with such a nib, I don't think that cursive is the optimal choice. Now, I know people who write with fountain pens and who write in print only. I also know people with fountain pens who write in cursive only, and I know people who do both. Some nibs, again, lend them better to one or the other. So I think that the shortest conclusion is different writing modes, not handwriting, but I mean different writing modes of writing instruments, fountain pen, ballpoint, rollerball, pencil, will lend themselves to different types of writing. For example, I find it quite unpleasant to write cursive with a pencil. If I write with a pencil, which doesn't happen a lot, but if it does, then I typically write in print. If I write with this rollerball, then I write in cursive, but then this Laban has a tip that is a little bit more feedbacky. You could say scratchy if you want. I find it quite pleasant, but with this one, I like print better. So even within modes, it can vary. Sometimes I think we have to accept the fact that there are no intelligible conclusions to draw about some of these observations, which is not me poking fun at anyone, and definitely not at the person who asked the question, because I think it's a great question. I just think that if things would be any other way, that things would be different. So, in other words, if I stole that from Bill Nye, sorry, but if you have to do what works for you. And I too feel that way, right? Again, I'm not making fun of the person who asked the question. I feel that way too. For me, with fountain pens, it's cursive. With other pens, it could be cursive, it could be print. It depends on the pen, it depends on the situation, it depends on what I'm trying to do. If I have to leave a note for, say, a colleague, and I need to make sure, absolutely sure they can read it, then I try to write in print, because I think it's more legible than cursive can be. My cursive can be anyway. Having said all that, the final thing I will say about it is, I do think that fountain pens lend themselves to cursive very nicely. But I've also had discussion with people who said, I just can't do cursive. And some people were concerned because I can't do cursive. Does that mean I don't get the full fountain pen experience? No, it doesn't. You have to do what works best for you and what makes you happy. And if that means using a fountain pen with a triple broad nib to write print, then write print. It's okay. You can do whatever you want. So, conclusion, pens are tools. And you would adjust the tool to the specific job you're trying to do. And sometimes the job may be cursive and sometimes it may not be. And that's pretty much it. And I think it's all normal. I think maybe different writing instruments just work well for different types of writing. And if you don't like those types of writing, that's perfectly fine too. I hope that sort of answers the question. I enjoy these questions a lot, by the way. I don't know about you, but I enjoy these questions a lot. So I hope this is useful. Please leave me any other questions you have. If I don't answer your question in the next episode, that may be because I already had some questions, but any question that's really interesting, I will answer at some point. Okay? So sometimes you may have to be a little patient, but just leave the question. I'll do what I can. Hope this was useful, and I'm glad to see you later. Bye-bye.